Have you ever had this moment when you saw something or heard something or learned about something that demanded you go check it out? Maybe you were told by someone you love, be watching for this, be paying attention to this, be on the lookout. And then, after many years of watching and looking out for it, you saw it. This morning I want to tell you about what happened when I saw something that I was told to watch for. I want to tell you about what happened when I saw the star and traveled to Bethlehem and was given the gift of gifts by God, who allowed me to lay a gift before the King of Kings. I want to tell you what happened after. Allow me to introduce myself, or tell you a little bit about myself. I am a magi. I know I'm wearing a suit, but the attire of the court of Susa is not appropriate for this place. Some of you know who we are. Maybe you've consulted the works of Herodotus, the Greek historian, and you know that we are an ancient hereditary priestly tribe who were originally part of the Medes. And due to some rather unique skills and engaging in some occult activities, and due to our ability to interpret the stars and understand astrological and astronomical signs, and our ability to interpret omens and dreams and engage in divination and sorcery and other occult activities, also our skill in mathematics and natural history and agriculture and architect. Due to all this, we rose to places of prominence within the Babylonian government. And then, after the fall of the Babylonian Empire, we rose to prominence in the Medo-Persian Empire. And then after the Persians were conquered by Alexander the Greek, we rose to prominence within the Parthian Empire. And we had a variety of functions. We served as priests. And honestly, our religion was a counterfeit of the temple of God, of the God of Israel. It was a counterfeit of true worship. It was a worship and religion that involved occult activities, and in many ways it sought to mirror some of the things that we brought in from Jewish practices. As we conquered them, we came to know about some of their worship, and we served as priests to the Babylonians and then the Persians and then the Parthians. But beyond that, we had other duties. In addition to our priestly work, we filled a variety of other roles depending on the empire we served. For instance, in the Medo-Persian Empire, in addition to serving as priests, we also shaped laws and served as judges. If you look in the book of Esther, you'll see an indication that the royal bench of judges was always chosen from the Magi. In the Parthian Empire, in addition to our priestly work, we also formed the upper house of the Council of the Magistenes. Now you have no idea what that is. The closest analogy that I can give you, it was similar to the Senate in your government. But beyond that, in both the Medo-Persian and the Parthian Empire, we also served as kingmakers. In the Parthian Empire, we elected the king of the Parthian Empire. And before that, within the Persian Empire, no Persian was ever able to become king except on two conditions. First, he had to master the scientific and religious disciplines of the Magi, and he had to be approved of and crowned by the Magi. And so for many centuries, in addition to religious duties, we also served as important government officials, and most importantly of all, we were the kingmakers. That's the first thing you should know about us. With that, you should know that we were not just priests and government officials and kingmakers. We were also priests and government officials and kingmakers of the empire directly to the east of Rome, and an empire that Rome had had repeated wars with. The Parthian Empire was a vast empire. Truth be told, we were a rival of Rome. We ruled much of the old Persian Empire. We ruled the whole Fertile Crescent. Our lands ran to Armenia and included parts of Turkey. They also ran all the way, going the other way, east of the Tigris, all the way to the Kush Mountains in what you would think of as Afghanistan. We ruled a monstrous chunk of real estate. And yet, despite our size, the Romans kept thinking they could tangle with us. In fact, 54 years before the star appeared, Rome tried to conquer Parthia, and they got their heads handed to them. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who defeated Spartacus and the richest man in Rome, who, along with Pompey and Julius Caesar, created what they called the Triumvirate. They ruled Rome as the three of them. This was one of the three most powerful men in Rome. Took an army of 7 legions out to tangle with us, and it didn't go well for him. His army was decimated. We cut it in half, and only a quarter of his men made it back to the Roman Empire alive. And then in addition to that, just as a bit of insult from the Romans' perspective, we took their beloved legionnaire eagles, and then beyond that, after we killed Crassus, some of the historians, including Plutarch, recounted that we desecrated Crassus's body. And in fact, we poured molten gold down the head as a symbol of his thirst for wealth, and then we kept it around as a souvenir. And we brought it out for a royal wedding one time. The reality is, we were not friends with each other. And after that, we didn't really have much peace. Rome fell into civil wars, and we kept meddling in the middle of all that. And we used it as an opportunity to weaken the empire. But beyond that, in about 40 years before the star appeared, we invaded Syria and conquered all the way to the coast entire. We overthrew the Hasmoneans who ruled old Israel and Jerusalem, and we took out the client king who served Rome and replaced him with a different client king, a different Hasmonean who was loyal to us. And then in addition to that, we pinned down Herod at Masada and almost got him. Eventually he escaped to Petra, and then after that he made it to Rome, and there he managed to get named King of the Jews by the Roman Empire, by Augustus. And then he was sent back with an army of Romans, and they pushed us out, and they overthrew the Hasmoneans, and he became the sole ruler of that region under Rome. And all of that was bloody, and it was painful, and needless to say, after that, and because of all that, there was no love lost between the empires. And every time we made a move, Rome worried. Herod looked at us in particular, and he saw us as a threat. He saw us as somebody who could invade at any time, and we worked things out to live at peace. It was considered one of Augustus's great achievements to have peace between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire. But we always looked at each other with a bit of skepticism. We were always one step away from declaring war with each other. Now, if those are the two of the basic facts you should know about us, Magi, there's a third thing you should know about us. We were watching for the appearance of a star that would signal the arrival of a new king of the Jews. That may surprise you, but we were watching the stars knowing that promises had been made that there would be a king of the Jews who would be a king to end all kings. And we were looking forward to the moment when that king came. Now, all of that requires a bit of explanation. If you were to go into Jewish scripture, you would find that a story that every man, woman, and child knew, a story that we had come to know. That story was how at the beginning of the world, God made the world perfect, but the first people rebelled against God. They shook their fist at God. God, the great king over all the earth, the God who made the seas, the one who formed the dry land, the God who was over everything, created those first forebears, and when he made the world, it was perfect. And yet, they rebelled, and they brought sin, suffering, and death into the world, and they should have been judged. Sin deserves judgment. And yet, in his great mercy, that God, the God of gods, the God over all, he gave them a promise. While they died spiritually and would die physically eventually, he gave them a promise, and he said, I will send a Messiah. I will send a king. I will send someone who will put the world right. And we didn't know it, and he didn't say it at that moment, but who would be the king to end all kings. And after that, the world became a place of chaos. It became a place where empires clashed, where Cain killed Abel, a place where brothers failed to live at peace. Instead of being a place where we lived at peace with God and at peace with our brothers, it became a place of clash, of division, of enmity. We needed a king who would rule with a rod of iron and set the world right, but we did not have that king. And yet, when you looked in the Jewish scriptures, what you found was that there was promise after promise after promise that God would send a Messiah. In fact, he said to the great-grandson of Abraham, Judah, he said, Judah is a lion's club. From the prey, my son, you have gone. And he said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff between his feet. And so he made this promise of a king. He declared that there would be a Messiah who would put things right, a king who would come and deal with sin and deal with injustice and reconcile God and man, who would deal with the fact that man needs to be judged for his sin. And he not only made this promise, he made other promises about kings coming. In fact, in one prophecy, he spoke of a king on whom the Spirit of the Lord would rest, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a king who delights in the fear of the Lord, a king who will not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he would judge for the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He made this promise, and all of those were interesting to us, but you know what really interested us? There was this prophecy in their book of Numbers that fascinated us. We were fascinated by the stars. And in the book of Numbers, there's a story that we just couldn't stop thinking about. When the Israelites invaded the promised land to conquer it, Balak, the king of Moab, sent for Balaam, who was a seer of sorts. He was a pagan seer, and he was from the town of Pethor on the Euphrates River near Persia, and he would make prophecies and predictions, and he was involved in all kinds of stuff, and the king of Moab asked Balaam to come and speak against Israel and perform divination against them, but of all the things that happened when he went to speak, the God of Israel spoke to Balak and said, you shall not say anything other than what I tell you. And then when he got up to make prophecies and speak, he spoke about how God would destroy Moab. But then beyond that, he spoke about a king who would come, an ultimate king, a king of the Jews, a king to end all kings. He said, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and it shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down the sons of Sheth. To us, this was the most fascinating of promises. The God of Israel said, a great king will come, a true king, a prophesied king to end all kings, and he will be preceded with a star. Remember, we were primarily astronomers and astrologers. Being preceded by a star was, well, you would think of it as being like catnip for you. It was something we were hooked on. It was the most fascinating promise. And we couldn't look away from it. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, how is it that pagan priests, astrologers and astronomers, people who are involved in things that had no reflection on how God ordered the world, came to be people who were watching for a promised Jewish king? That story is a giant story, but the short version is the Babylonians conquered Israel, and somehow we learned about it. Now, there's a lot of questions about how exactly we learned about it, and from which Jewish man we learned about it. But we conquered Jerusalem, and we carried away many captives, and in particular, most of us think that we learned about it from a particular Jewish man who was carried away captive by Nebuchadnezzar. a man trained in the art of the Magi, but who did not use the arts of the Magi to work. He used the wisdom of the God of Israel. This man's name was Daniel, and he actually became the leader of the Magi. There was a point in the history books that tell us that Nebuchadnezzar came with this insane request. He wanted the Magi to interpret his dream. But first, just to make sure we knew what we were talking about, he wanted us to tell him his dream. No Magi could do that. It was impossible. And yet, the God of Israel made it so Daniel could tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream and interpret the dream. And because of that, Daniel was made the head of the Magi. And beyond that, Nebuchadnezzar came to see that the God of Israel was the God of gods, the King of gods. And he said, truly, your God is the God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. And he put him in charge of all of the Magi. And from then on, he was associated with the Magi. For the rest of his life, he counseled us, and he taught us about the holy God of gods. And we learned about all that he knew. We learned about Jeremiah. We learned about Isaiah. He knew about them. If you look in your scriptures, you can see that he knew about the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah. He knew about many of the Jewish prophets, and he taught them to us. And many of us came to see that Daniel's God is the true God. And because of this all became part of the DNA of the Magi. And after that, the Magi, along with Israel, knew Daniel's story and the prophecies and studied his writings. And in many ways, it seemed clear that all of what he knew was passed on to us in some way, and because of that, we watched. And we watched. And we watched. And we knew the time had to be coming because Daniel, in Daniel 9, it spoke about a timeline that he left for us. And so we knew it had to be coming. And so we kept watching. And then one day we saw something. Unlike anything we'd ever seen in the sky, and we consulted and we found ourselves saying, this is a sign of signs. It has to be the sign we were told to look for. And given the situation, given that we were also fairly frustrated with our king, we said, we need to go and we need to see this king of the Jews, this king to end all king, and honor him and worship him. He may not be the king to rule our empire, but we must go and pay homage to him. We have longed for his birth. We have longed for his coming. And we've longed for it with the same intensity of the Jews, and so we must go. And so we put together an entourage to leave Susa, the capital of the empire, and follow the star. And you shouldn't think of this as 3 guys on camels. We took 3 gifts, but this wasn't 3 guys on camels. How would your senators travel? Would you send them into enemy territory, unarmed and unguarded? We rode Persian steeds, because that's what you rode as a member of the Magistines. We came wearing garments worthy of our office, accompanied by the proper protection. You don't ride into enemy territory unarmed. Kingmakers looking for a new king, the king of the Jews, when they have a king, certainly don't. You don't ride into Herod's territory unarmed. So we set out and we followed the star. And let me tell you, it was no short trip. We didn't know where the star was taking us. We assumed it would end us in Israel, in Jerusalem, but we didn't know. But we followed it over 1,000 miles from the capital of the Parthian Empire to Jerusalem. Now, many of you are probably wondering, what was this star? The fact is, we don't really understand it. It didn't act like a normal star. It was in the sky, it was a sign, but it wasn't a supernova or a comet, it wasn't an angel. It was more of a celestial body, but it moved in strange ways. We lost sight of it when we got near Jerusalem, it led us to Jerusalem, and then it disappeared. And then when it reappeared, it did something really weird. It moved from north to south. Now, normally, skies move across the horizon from east to west because of the way that the earth is rotating. But this one didn't do that. It didn't play by the proper rules. And so we can't tell you exactly what it was. For all we know, it may have just been a manifestation of the Shekinah glory of God, the glory of the God of Israel. But we cannot tell you exactly what it was. It didn't play by proper rules. But it led us to Jerusalem. Now, when we showed up, Herod lost it. We showed up and we started asking, where is the one born king of the Jews? And Herod freaked out. And there's any number of reasons why Herod freaked out. First of all, he was the king. And for one to be born king of the Jews meant that his days were numbered. But second, he was not born king of the Jews. He was named king of the Jews by the Romans. And so this was a massive threat. But beyond that, it wasn't just a massive threat of a new king. If something was destabilizing the region, he had to worry about Rome. One of Caesar Augustus' signature achievements as emperor was bringing peace with Parthia and getting the eagles back. This was considered something that was a big deal. In fact, he actually worked it out so that he oversaw the development of our king's sons. They were kept as hostages in Rome, and this was a way to make sure that there was peace. And he also gave our king a woman that the king married. And so this was a signature achievement. And if that was destabilized, Herod could lose his head. And so Herod was upset. And when Herod was upset, all Jerusalem got upset. Because Herod had been known to do some things. At one point, he killed half of the Sanhedrin. He was not a nice guy. He did not play nice with others. And so everyone was kind of in a panic. And we wrote in thinking everyone would be excited. We saw the sign. We assumed everybody else understood it and that they were all excited because a new king had been born. But instead we found that they were upset. And we knew this was delicate. We knew we were going into the territory. We knew that calling for a king of the Jews was kind of mocking him, saying that one born king of the Jews had come. That would kind of be a mock of him. It was delicate. But what surprised us was that he invited us to his court. The reality is he understood immediately that this was no normal king and that this was the fulfillment of prophecy. He actually said, "Where is the Messiah born?" when he gathered us with the religious leaders. And the religious leaders looked at him warily and gave him the answer. They told him and us, the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written in the prophets, "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." They told us about the prophecy in Micah, a prophecy from of old, a prophecy of a king who would stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, who would rule the people of God, and they would dwell secure, and he would be great to the ends of the earth and be their peace. And what I found fascinating about all this was that they were saying that long before we showed up, this had been a plan put in place by God, and it was being orchestrated by God, by their God, down to the last detail. And when I say their God, I should add that I had come to see that the God of Daniel was the God of gods. And so I should say that it was orchestrated by God, my God. And I found myself thinking, ruler of old, what does that mean? Does that mean that this king is some sort of pre-existent being come down, entering into rule from of old? What did that mean? It had to mean that he was a being that pre-existed his birth. And I didn't understand that at all. And as I thought about this, I realized that this king would not be limited to the rule of Israel. Being great to the ends of the earth meant he would rule the world. He would be the king to end all kings, as we were looking forward to. Now I sensed the weight of all this. I had sensed how it would threaten Herod, but I was surprised by the way the religious rulers and leaders acted. They seemed so disinterested. They seemed apathetic to this truth. You know, they lived less than 6 miles from where the Messiah was to be born, and yet they weren't paying attention or interested at all. And it may be that their disinterest was that they didn't want to wind Herod up. You know, if you have an unstable king, sometimes you keep control of your emotions and don't give any sign that you're interested. But they didn't show any interest in going and seeing this baby. They were quiet. They announced what was to be told, and then they left. And eventually we were sent away and then drawn back and brought back secretly. And when we were brought back secretly, we were surprised by the way Herod acted. He pressed us first to find out when the Messiah was born, when the star appeared. I was troubled by that, and I was careful, but others, they weren't so careful, and before long, that old fox pulled that information right out of them. But then he did something that surprised us. He told us to go and search diligently for the child, and said that when we found him, we were to bring him word that he could come and worship this baby. And for a moment, I thought maybe he sees the greatness of this baby, but at the same time, something didn't sit with me. I thought on the surface, this sounds good, but Herod only worships Herod. Herod's not looking out for anybody but himself. He lives for himself. You know, we can all live for ourselves, but Herod did this in spades. He was not going to let this baby live. He tried to kill it. You know, he only had a couple of questions. When, where, and how fast are you guys going to leave so I can kill this kid? But at the same time, I knew he was going to give us wide latitude. He was going to give us wide latitude because he didn't want to spark a war with the Parthians. And so after working out the timeline, he sent us to go see this baby. And so we left. And we departed Jerusalem. And we knew where we should be heading, but we didn't know where we were going to be going. But then that star, remember I said it acted funnily. It acted in a strange way. It just reappeared. And then it led us right down the road to Bethlehem. And then after leading us to Bethlehem, it stopped and hovered over the house. That was incredibly shocking. Stars don't hover over houses. But it stopped and it hovered over the house. And we were filled with joy. We were filled with joy that after all these months we were going to see this one we had come to see. And we were filled with overflowing joy. We'd been filled with joy all along, but now we had overflowing joy. The one who would be king of the nations was here. He wouldn't be the ruler of Parthia, but he would be the king of the nations. And so with joy, we dismounted. And the child's mother and adopted father were at the door. I mean, everybody was looking. You ride in with an entourage into a small town like Bethlehem, everybody's going to look. And they were staring in wonder. But everybody was even more in wonder because of what we did next. When we came in, we fell down before the child. And remember, this wasn't the day that the baby was born. Time had gone by. They were now living in a house. We went into that house, and we fell down, and we did something that shocked them. We fell down and worshipped. In our regale, in our dress, we prostrated ourselves in the dirt, and we worshipped the one whose birth was preceded and announced by the star. It had guided us to this place, and convinced that we were standing before the one that was prophesied by the star, the one-born King of the Jews, we bowed down in worship. We worshiped the God of gods, who so long ago had shown Nebuchadnezzar that he was the one true God. After that, we got out gifts. Gifts that symbolized the truths that we had been shown by Daniel and by the Jewish scriptures. We got out gold. Gold as to a king. Gold from the veins of earth we brought. Red gold to crown the King of Kings, power and glory to behold. Gold was the currency of kings. It was a way to acknowledge this one's right to rule. In fact, Seneca, The distinguished Roman orator acknowledged that it was customary in our empire that nobody approached a king without gold. It was the proper gift. And so we brought him gold to confess his kingship. Born a king on Bethlehem's plain. Gold I bring to crown him again, king forever, ceasing never, over us all to reign. With that gold, we brought something else. We brought frankincense. Frankincense is an aromatic, clear resin obtained from trees in northern India and Arabia. It was used in incense and perfume and was treasured for its aroma and its healing properties. It was often used in temples for worship. In fact, if you went into the Jewish temple and tabernacle, you would have found that it was covered in gold, it was anointed with myrrh, and it smelled of frankincense. And so we gave it to him. This child was special. He was to be a priest, and as a priest, he would offer loud prayers. But more than that, he was the one to whom incense deserved to be offered because he was the king to end all kings, the God of gods come down. And so incense was the appropriate gift. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Myrrh as to one who will die. Myrrh is a bitter gift for the dead. Birth begins the pangs you tread. Your way is short, your days foretold by myrrh and frankincense and gold. We brought myrrh. Myrrh was a spice used for medicine, cosmetics, anointing oil, pain relief, and most importantly, embalming. And so we brought it because we knew that Isaiah and the Psalms proclaimed a truth about this child. He was coming to be king. He was the God come to be king. But he was also coming to bear the weight of sin. He would bear the weight of the sins of the world on his shoulders. And the punishment for sin is death, and he would bear it. But that would not be the end. The prophecy foretold that he would not only die, but rise, and having risen, he would rule forever. But knowing these prophecies, knowing what was coming, we offered myrrh. Myrrh to symbolize the fact that he would be buried. Myrrh to symbolize the fact that while we were sinners, he would die for us. Having left his Father's throne, he would die for us. And when he did that, he would fulfill God's promises to save his people, to save the Jews and to all whom God was calling. Myrrh is mine, a bitter perfume, breathes a life of gathering doom, sighing, sorrow sighing, bleeding, dying, sealed in a stone-cold tomb. But that would not be the end. We would behold him gloriously rising. As I laid it before him, I wondered, would we? Would he die sacrificially and rise as the scriptures foretold? I had no way of knowing. Having come, we stayed and we worshiped him and we honored his family appropriately. Too soon it came to be time to depart, and having accomplished our mission, we had to leave. I mean, we were still in enemy territory, and Herod had handled us softly, given that his army was out of his territory, off with other Roman armies. But given Herod's nature, we didn't want to stay too long. One of the questions we had is, knowing that this baby has been born, is Herod going to try to kill this king? And should we protect him? We weren't sure, but then God gave us a dream, and he told us to return home, but not go by way of Herod. And that told us several things, but one of the things it told us, along with saying, don't go back to Herod, was this God will take care of this child. He will protect this child. You know, Daniel had been protected by lions, by an angel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been thrown into a fire, and they had been protected by the God of gods. We thought, given his nature, given his record, he will protect this child. And so, having been warned, we did not return to Parthia by way of Jerusalem. We took other roads. And later we heard that all our fears about Herod turned out to be right. We heard that in a rage, having seen that he had been tricked, he sent soldiers and killed all the children under 2 years old. And so my understanding is that he gave himself a thick cushion. He didn't take any chances. He killed everybody that was within range of being in fulfillment of this prophecy. And it was horrible. And yet in that, God was fulfilling a prophecy in Jeremiah about a voice heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Ultimately, we lost track of Jesus for a while. He dropped out of sight, and we had no way of knowing. Later, though, I heard from some diplomats in Egypt something that made me think he escaped. A man who worshipped the God of Daniel and served in the Magestines and represented us to Egypt told me that he heard about a family that had gone to Egypt. And the father's name was Joseph, and he had been told by an angel that he was to take his child, his wife and her child, and flee to Egypt. And I wouldn't have believed it, but the man told me that Joseph had Parthian gold with him, which made me think that maybe, probably, God had allowed them to escape and provided for them by giving us his gold for them to live in Egypt. And that made me believe that our trust in the God of gods had been warranted and that he had protected the one-born King of the Jews. And after that, I heard nothing. For many, many, many years, I listened and wondered. I wondered if he would take the throne. I wondered if the one-born King of the Jews would fulfill the prophecies of bearing sin and defeating death. I wondered, and after growing old, I wondered more. Near the end of my life, I got answers. Long after I had went back to Parthia, a day came when a traveler came through, following the Silk Road from Rome to China, right through Parthia. The Silk Road ran right through the Parthian Empire, and so we had travelers who would bring us news, and he brought us news about events in Jerusalem. He told me about a man who claimed to be God come down, a man who was crucified by the Romans after he was hailed the Son of David. And when he was crucified, over his head there was a sign, King of the Jews. But that traveler said the strangest thing happened. He said 3 days after, his tomb was opened, and his disciples and the women who were with them saw him. And he said that 500 people claimed to have seen this man alive after his crucifixion at one time, and after that, he said that this man ascended into heaven. After claiming to be God, after facing death and defeating death, he rose and he appeared, and then he ascended into heaven. And then the traveler said something else. He said the man's name was Jesus, and that they called him the Christ. And the man said after a ministry of healing and miracles that Jesus predicted that he would go to the cross and be crucified to pay for the sins of the world and rise. And he said that he believed that Jesus had rose. And he was a part of a group that were being called Christians. And that he believed that Jesus was God and that he died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he believed that someday, having ascended to heaven, he would return in glory, and when he came, he would come to judge the living and the dead and rule for all eternity. When he told me this, my heart leaped for joy, because it was all that I hoped to hear. But it was the man's name that led me to fall down in worship. Because when I heard it, I knew that this man was the child I went to see all those years ago. And I knew that every word of the prophecy had come true. A star had come out of Jacob, and a scepter rose out of Israel, and it rose to rule. And that rule has begun, and someday it will come to completion. Someday every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that the one we saw, the one born King of the Jews, is King of kings and Lord of lords. He's the King to end all kings, the promised King, and they will see this and bow. I believe this. I believe in him. Do you? That is my story. It's probably not the one you expected, because it didn't include camels and did involve geopolitics. But the story, it's way more interesting than the legends that some people developed. It's the story how men like me were shaped by the influence of Jews like Daniel and came to worship the one true King and came to hope in the King to end all kings, the one born King of the Jews, Jesus Christ. Now I need to wrap up. You've heard enough about my story, but here at Christmas I want to leave you with some truths. Truths I learned through the coming of Christ. Truths I learned as I journeyed and met with Herod and worshiped Christ. Truths I learned after. First, Jesus is the King come to rule eternally. He did not come to rule Parthia or Rome or Jerusalem alone. He didn't come to set up a kingdom that exists for a time and fades away. He came to rule as King of the Jews for all eternity. You know, some people wonder, were we looking for a king to come help us fight the Romans? I can't speak for the others, but I can say we were looking for Daniel's king to worship him. Because we didn't need another king who would win some battles and become old and weak. We needed a king who would come and put the world right and rule for all eternity. And someday, having ascended, he will come and do this. Know this. That's the first truth I learned. Here's the second. His coming demands a response. It demands your allegiance. You know, there was 3 responses to him. One was Herod's, which was enmity, antagonism, a refusal to bow down to his rule. The second was apathy, which is a different form of refusing to bow down to his rule. It's just saying, But then there's the third response, the right response, our response. It's the response that his coming demands. When you see the one who is the King of Kings, the right response is to bow down and worship him. That's the second truth. Here's the third. When you come to him, you have to relate to him as king. You don't come to him and say, serve me. When you come to the King of Kings, you lay your sword at his feet, and when he commands, you obey. That is the only right response to an earthly king. It is certainly the right response to the true King of Kings. One of the marks of following him is a willingness to acknowledge that he is the king over your life. To say you believe in him but refuse to obey him is hypocrisy. It's treason against him. When you come to him, you have to serve him as knowing that he is king. But more than this, he is king for everyone. Know this truth. Know this fourth truth. He is king for everyone. He's the king of the Jews, but he's king for more than the Jews. He's the king for us. You know, the fact that we were called and led by God to go and see him announces that he didn't just come for the people of Israel. He came for all the nations and all the ends of the earth. He's a God for all peoples. God says through his word, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant and restore the tribe of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will make you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. He is the one who brings his salvation to the ends of the earth. Do not miss this. He came as king of the Jews, but the mission is greater. There's another truth. Know this. Someday he will return, and everyone will bow down before him. And you know, his coming, his birth, his life, his death and resurrection, his ascension, and all declares one truth. You need a Savior. One irreverent person once said, if Jesus is the answer, what's the question? And the answer to that irreverent question is, how can a person who worships himself or anything and everything else but the one true God have everlasting fellowship with the true God? It's how can people who have sinned and rebelled against and despised the one true God be forgiven by that one true God? And the answer to those questions is Jesus. You know, Herod failed to answer rightly to his everlasting sorrow. But the reality is, everyone needs to see those questions. And they're the questions to which the answer is Jesus. And if you turn to him and trust him and see that he is the king for everyone, the king you need, you will have a hope and a joy and a life for all eternity. This is the fifth truth I learned, but here's the sixth. To reject him as Herod did comes with grave consequences. Do not make that foolish move. Rebelling against the King of all brings his wrath down. When you rebel against an earthly king, it brings judgment. Rebelling against the heavenly king brings judgment that is far greater. Do not miss this. Finally, I would say this. Following him leads us to embrace the battle. You know, we were led to a moment where we had to pick. Are we going to do what Herod wants or do what God wants? You know, God said, go, leave by a different route. Don't go back to Herod. And as we did, we knew that a battle was beginning to rage, and we were called to pick a side and serve to advance the cause of one king or another. Turning and following this king calls us to embrace the battle and know that there is a battle, but we serve to advance the crown of the King of Kings. We must know this. Now, before I end, I just want to say a few things. Know that this happened. It happened in the days of Augustus when Herod ruled. It happened. And know that the truths that I told you are true. But know this, you cannot honor God properly unless you come to see that you are a sinner and that Christ is the Savior for you need, the one who will rule in your heart and in your life and rescue you from the domain of darkness. And if you're not a Christian, my plea to you is trust him. Finally, I would say this. Here on Christmas, the right response is our response. Worship him. He is the King come down. The King come to rule for all eternity. Worship him. Let's pray.